All right, good afternoon, everybody. Good evening, good morning, whichever it is for you at the time. This lecture on the Korean War was supposed to be tagged with my early Cold War lecture, which dealt with the Cold War in Europe from 1945 to 1949, and then I usually put the Korean War at the end of that. But at the time I wasn't really sure how long that online lecture was going to be, so I decided to break it up. So this will be quite a short lecture, and not to suggest that the Korean War deserves only sort of a footnote in the history of the Cold War, because certainly that is not the case. This was a major event that really saw the first time the Americans actively became involved in adhering to the principles of the Truman Doctrine. Now remember, the 1947 Truman Doctrine was designed as a way for the United States to offer help to any peoples who were suffering from internal or external subversion from communist forces. And unfortunately that sort of sees the United States dragging themselves all over the world, because there seem to be brush fire wars dealing with either independence movements or grassroots, Marxist-inspired revolutions and so forth. So that being said, the Korean War is sort of a hot spot. This was a hot war. And even though it was a UN action, it's fair to say that it was predominantly an American action. There were, of course, other nations there as well, but the major force were Americans, led by, and the UN forces were led by none other than Douglas MacArthur, the great World War II hero. So, yeah, so let's move right into it. Korea remained a Japanese colony until the end of World War II. Now, I believe it was 1910 when the Japanese annexed Korea and basically treated it like an extension of their own empire, but also was quite brutal. There's no question, it's well documented, that it was a relatively brutal occupation. Many hundreds of thousands of women were put into servitude as comfort women, which continued right up until the end of the war. So, at the end of World War II, there was a tremendous relief to be rid of the Japanese occupiers who had been there for about 35 years. On August 6th, the USSR declared war on Japan, keeping to a commitment with the USA, and began an attack on the northern part of the peninsula on August 8th. Okay, now this came out of Potsdam. This was basically something I believe Stalin had promised way back at the February Yalta Conference, saying that we won't declare war on Japan, that's the Soviet Union, until Nazi Germany is defeated, because they had their hands full on the Eastern Front. When Nazi Germany is defeated, and very soon after, they do declare war. You'll notice the date, right around the Hiroshima circumstance, which I believe was August 6th as well. So the agreement was that they would invade from the north, and then the Americans and others would invade from the south, and they would come down from both ends and then reduce the Japanese presence, or rather eliminate the Japanese presence. The situation in Korea was almost identical to that to Vietnam, how that nation got involved in having foreign powers remove the Japanese presence. And the agreement at the 17th parallel was very similar to the agreement they had at the 38th parallel here. So here we have the Soviets coming from the north, pushing down, they're coming up here, pushing down, and then the Americans and allies coming up this way. So they stopped at the 38th. That was the agreement that the Americans made with the Soviets, and then here come the Americans from the south. Now the purpose was simply to remove the Japanese invaders. But what kind of government do you think the Soviets are going to encourage and support in their now occupied zone of the north? And what kind of government and system are the American occupiers going to support? pretty straightforward. And that's why this became a mess pretty quickly. In fact, the Americans were already concerned about this because they knew that the division of Germany was problematic and Berlin was in crisis. How do you divide a country between nations that have two completely different economic systems? So the writing was on the wall before this, but as agreed, there they were. Both sides would administer their halves, both supporting Korean-led governments, but each favorable to their respective countries' ideology. So it's not surprising. Were there communist elements in Korea already? Of course there were. Were there anti-communist elements in South Korea? Of course there were. So, I mean, you know, what happens, and this is much like when the Soviets take control of Eastern Europe, you know, they find people, Polish communists or Romanian communists, and they basically prop them up. So, you know, so that wasn't too difficult to find. Americans would back Syngman Rhee in the South, and the USSR would back Kim Il-sung, who is the grandfather of the current leader of Korea. Okay, so that's where we're at. So in 1949, both the USA and the USSR withdrew forces, leaving behind two Koreas divided politically, economically, and ideologically. So, to what extent do we blame the Soviets and the Americans for leaving this mess? I mean, I think they were just doing what they were doing, and they did so out of a fear of having their countries go, you know, having Korea fall apart into anarchy or chaos. So of course they're going to prop up their respective occupied areas and encourage governments that fell in line with their economic systems. But what happens is, you know, you have a very anti-communist government in the South and you have a firmly communist government in the North, both of whom see themselves as the eventual leader of a greater Korea. There was never any intention for Korea to remain divided. That was not supposed to happen. That was not in the playbook. And the exact same thing was the case for Vietnam as well. But the moment that communists become significant in both Vietnam in the north and Korea in the north, that's when that dividing line was going to remain firm. Both sides had designs of unifying the country along their own political lines, and on June 25th, 1950, the North struck and within days pushed the South to Seoul. So the North Korean army, you know, invigorated on a wave of national euphoria, crosses the border to push and pushes the South Korean army all the way down to Seoul. So it was very quick. And, you know, the UN had to make a decision pretty quick. Because of the heightened sensitivity and fear of communism in the States, and if you saw my early Cold War lecture, that you get an understanding of that, in conjunction with the lecture dealing with McCarthyism, what happens domestically in the United States during the Red Scare period, the Americans understandably saw this invasion by the North as a monolithic attack by the communist world, and not so much as an indigenous civil war. Now, of course, it was a civil war because they were both Koreans, but those unnatural differences were created by the Americans and the Soviets. So it's understandable how the Americans in the West could see this as the Soviet Union kind of pushing the North Koreans along to do this. And in fact, initially, Stalin wasn't keen on this situation, but of course later he would support the North in the process. Truman actively pursued involvement for several reasons. Firstly, and this is very important, China fell to communists in 1949, the year before. His containment policy sought to hold back the spread of communism, and domestic pressure from the McCarthyites, who called Truman soft on communism. So there were many variables: the complexity of the domestic political landscape in the U.S., the complexity of the commitments that Truman made in his policy of containment, which was within the Truman Doctrine. the Americans didn't want to look like hypocrites to say, well, we made all these promises of what we're going to do to save the free world, and now we're just going to back away from Korea. So I think in many ways, clearly Truman had lots of reasons to get involved in this situation. At the time of the UN resolution, the USSR was boycotting the UN over China being excluded from the UN. Okay, I'll clarify this in a moment. Mao's communist forces had just won a bitter civil war. What's very, very interesting is that at the time, a resolution was made in the United Nations by the Security Council to go to war. The Soviet Union at that moment was boycotting the UN because the UN did not recognize Mao Zedong's communist government in China as a legitimate Chinese government. They recognized Chiang Kai-shek's government in Taiwan instead. And the Soviets are like, how can you pretend like the People's Republic of China does not exist, and how can you not recognize it? So therefore we boycott it. Now, had the Soviets not been boycotting the UN at the time where the Security Council made the resolution to go to war, the Soviets would have vetoed it, and there would have been no Korean War. So the remarkable thing is just the chance and timing of this thing, that because the Soviets' vote didn't mean anything because they were boycotting at the time, the Security Council got the vote to invade, or get involved rather. Under Macarthur's command, the U.S.-led forces, under Macarthur's command, the U.S.-led forces outnumbered the North by 180,000 to 100,000. The North was quickly pushed out of the South after landings at Incheon Harbor. So by the time the UN troops get together, predominantly American, they get to South Korea and they push the North Koreans out. Now the goal was, understandably, to push the North Koreans out of South Korea. Get them up past that 38th parallel and call it a day. October 1950, the UN crossed over the 38th parallel and captured Pyongyang on October 19th. So now the South Korean and UN forces have captured the capital of North Korea. And China became concerned as the UN drew closer to the Yalu River, the border between China and North Koreans. Now you're already thinking, well, why the heck was the UN up that far? Well, this is where we get into interesting personalities and the impact of ego and the impact of arrogance. Now, don't get me wrong, Douglas MacArthur was a remarkable general, but you know, oftentimes in order to be in a position to have to make such difficult decisions, you do have to a certain degree, you have to have a certain degree of confidence. I mean, a lot of these generals, so you look at George Patton, another kind of egomaniac, but brilliant. General Douglas MacArthur made the unilateral decision to keep going. He did not have orders from the President of the United States at the time. In fact, MacArthur had made suggestions to others that they should keep going and give China a run for their money, and if they don't fall quickly enough, we'll just drop bombs on Beijing and Shanghai. I mean, it was preposterous, but basically what happens is the UN keeps going. And as they get close to the Yalu River, the Chinese are saying, whoa, whoa, wait a second here. You guys are getting way too close to our border. And Truman wanted the UN to halt, and MacArthur wanted to continue into China. As we said before, China would cross the Yalu River with close to 300,000 troops, quickly pushing the UN south again. Americans were completely caught off guard. So this was interesting. The only time that Communist China and the United States had ever been involved in a shooting war, but it was instigated by the fact that MacArthur was not willing to stop. He wanted to keep going, and understandably, the Chinese felt that they were getting too close. So MacArthur would be fired by Truman for insubordination. You couldn't let him get away with just making a unilateral decision of this nature where you're dealing with such incredibly delicate geopolitics. And you know, I mean, he was given hero's welcome, big fanfare, you know, lots of ribbons and people in the streets, and you know, he makes a great speech, you know. So I mean, I think he wasn't really humiliated. Maybe he might have been personally, but you know, the Americans would never forget his contributions in the Second World War, and he was still lauded as a great hero, despite the fact that he was relieved from his duties from insubordination. Fighting would end July 1953 with a truce signed by North Korea, China, and the UN. South Korea's government was not included. It's interesting. So we have a truce, or like November 11, 1918, an armistice, right? This is not a peace treaty. This is a halting of tensions, a halting of military action between North and South Korea. And here we are, well into the 21st century, and there is still not a peace treaty signed officially between North and South Korea. That's why it's such a delicate area. That's why the DMZ, or demilitarized zone, between North and South Korea is such a hot spot. And you know, there's been skirmishes there. There's been brush fire shooting and people escaping and running through the DMZ and so on and so forth. That situation continues to this day. All right, well, that being said, as I said, this was going to be a very short lecture, and it is sort of, should be tagged on to the Cold War in Europe, 1945 to 49. If you haven't seen that one, I would watch that one before this, or if you've already seen this, go back and watch that one. And then after the Korean War, I have a lecture dealing with the Cold War during the Khrushchev era, 1956 roughly to 1964. So anyway, short but sweet, and thank you very much. We'll see you next time. Take care.